Part 2 of our conversation with radio legend Jeff Woods. I'm John Beaudin from Rock History Canada. Anyone interested in classic rock in this country would know the Legends of Classic Rock series from Jeff Woods and the Records and Rockstar radio show. In 2016, Jeff Woods released his autobiography, Radio Records and Rockstars. And he has a new podcast. By the way, part 1 of this series is on our bigger station, Rock History Music. We'll have links to it in the description of this video, and all links to Jeff Woods also in the description of this video. Part 2 of our conversation with the great Jeff Woods. So recall, getting back to that. Again, like I said, when I talk to artists, my first question is, I mean, it's an open slate, man. This is your freaking life. Like, where do you start? And there's categorizing and all this. And you did, I'm so impressed by what you did with this book. I've read a lot of these books, but where did it start for you? Did you have a clear idea? Was it just follow your nose?
I was so fortunate to be able to speak to 90% of the artists that mattered from the age of, 12, 13, 14 to now. Somehow I was in a position to get to interview all of these guys and women. So it just fell into place. I thought back to the interviews that really mattered the most to me, and they invariably were the artists that had the greatest impact. They were Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. They were David Bowie. They were Bob Seger. They were Joe Walsh. They were all these guys that mattered so much in the 70s when I was coming of age. The fact that I got to speak to them, the book wrote itself.
By the way, you were the guy. My son did when you were at Q107 here in Calgary, yeah. You reposted a video of Chase doing Tom Sawyer. He was 9. Right.
Yes.
I never forgot that, and thank you. He's a lazy teenager now. He still can do Tom Sawyer just as good as that. And thanks to, who's the guy that you mentioned him? Coney Hatch, he works for Rush.
Andy Curran.
Andy Curran sent Chase concert use sticks from Neil Peart.
That's cool.
That's classy.
It's funny. These guys come back into your life. Well, you and Chase, your son, Andy Curran. I remember being in my parents' basement when I was 17, listening to the Coney Hatch records, thinking what a great song Monkey Bars is. It's goofy. It's fun, though, and he's the bassist and lead vocalist on that song. And I would go see Coney Hatch in concert. And then, 40 years later, I'm hanging out with Andy at the Alma Combo a few weeks ago. They're having a kind of a relaunch party. And we became friends, and then he turned me on to Big Rec, and I got to know Ian. It's just such a small, but if you're decent to these people when you're young, as you know, as you were with me and I've been with you, they do come back around. And there's a symbiosis, and there's a connection you have with people that lasts your whole life if you're lucky, and if you're sincere, and if you're decent, and if you care. And our common, thread is obviously music. And I can tell from talking to you, and you can tell from talking to me, that we both love it just as much today as when we first heard it. And I hope we never lose that.
Bro Jake, I met him at CKCW, I think it was. I was 17. We were going to see Chilliwack and, of all things, Seals and Crofts in Moncton, New Brunswick. And I remember I was just scared of the guy. I was so young, and he had a thing then,
I thought of him, and I don't know why. So this morning, before this call, I was driving to Collingwood, which is down the street from where I live, to a chiro appointment. And I don't know why I thought of him. I have no clue why he popped into my head. But I thought back to a story about I thought back to a few stories about Bro Jake. Not excluding the fact that he was my first boss, and then I became his boss 20 years later. The one thing I remembered about him, a buddy of mine did a motorbike trip with him down the East Coast in the 80s. And they went into a bar one evening, and a little Frenchman in New Brunswick came up to Bro Jake, who had come in from Halifax on the motorbike, was my buddy, and said, "Hey, Magoo," as in Mr. Magoo, because Jake's got funny eyes. He can see fine, but, they're a little bit of a... And Jake said, "Don't you ever fucking call me that again." Because he had changed his name from Vernon Mazarol to Bro Jake, which is a cool name. But Magoo was his nickname because of his eyes. He had a lot of stories like that. But you're right. Bro Jake had the biggest personality I've ever met in radio. There was no one stronger, bolder, bigger sounding, more confident. and a real fan of music. Everyone loved Bro Jack. He's retired now, if you hadn't heard.
I didn't know.
Yeah, just recently, because he went from rock radio, eventually a few years ago, to sports radio. He either hung up sports radio or it was just an award he got. So sometimes when people get an award, you think they've retired. Maybe he's still doing sports radio. But he got into the Canadian music industry / radio industry Hall of Fame last year, I guess. And deservedly so. I loved that son of a bitch.
Oh, yeah.
So we continue to love him.
You're like Al Pacino, by the way, and you've probably heard this before from Godfather 3. Just when you think you're out, they suck you back in. You're the quintessential, mind you, there's a lot of radio guys that come in and out, but I kept thinking that reading the book.
Yeah, it's true. You know, I guess it was the Bear. When I left the Bear to get into the record industry in 95, my boss then said, you can't keep leaving. Like, at a certain point, people won't have you come back. And I said, I did respect you, but I disagree with you. I said, I'm going to go get more experience. To your point earlier about what do you have to contribute when you're young? You got to go and learn stuff and have some knowledge and have some perspective and have some opinion to come back and do it effectively. I said, I'm going to go get some more of that stuff by working in the record business. And then if it feels right and the money's right, I'll come back to radio someday, maybe. And sure enough, after 2 years of the record business, where I thought everybody was going to be a genius, I was wrong. I went back to radio because the money was better and the city was better and the station was better. And I was more ready to communicate effectively as a result. So, yeah, I got sucked back in, and that wasn't the last time.
The record store, I enjoyed that because, you know, there's these cliches, right, Jeff, we hear about the fact that, we're frustrated, all frustrated musicians, and we all want a record store. Every DJ wants to own a record store. And I went, well, you own a record store, man, in Toronto. I mean...
Fun. That was another transition. I'd left Halifax radio way back before I wanted to get into the record business, but I thought, I'm not ready for that yet, but I can do a record store maybe. Went and borrowed the money, quit my radio job, opened a record store. You know, how hard can it be? I thought to myself. I was 24. And it wasn't that difficult. Passion, bank loan, determination, energy, knowledge, willingness to learn. So for 3 years, sales increased. We had fun. We sold tons of records. We had experiences. I bought a new car. I thought, this self-employment isn't so bad. And, you know, the one thing people always said when you start a business is, do you know the failure rate of new businesses? And I said, yeah, but there's always telltale signs. What a stupid name. What a shitty sign. What a bad location. You're selling stuff people don't want. There's lots of reasons why businesses fail, and oftentimes it's pretty fundamental. I'm not saying it was easy and anyone can do it, but I'm saying if I can, maybe anyone else can too.
And then there was a guy in a Jaguar driving around.
The Jag story is great.
I loved it.
That's worth the price of admission in my book. Yeah. Oh my God. And he was a Vietnam draft dodger who became my best friend in the world. And the shit he went through. The story is quite harrowing in the book, considering how it ended up. So. Well,
he was an enigma. When I was reading it, to me, I figured, I would have thought this guy's an enigma. I don't know if I could have figured. I mean, he was a lot of sides to that guy.
A lot of sides to that guy. And at the end of the day, though, when you boil it down, like you and like me, we were just music fans. We were just big kids that still loved those records. And sure, there were other things going on in our lives that were sometimes dark and sometimes complex. At the end of the day, we just wanted to go home and listen to a Beatles record or a Byrds record in his case. So the Byrds had a lot of records, and then the guys that were in the Byrds had a lot of solo projects, and so his Byrds section was this big. He had 75 Byrds and Byrds related records, and I never saw anybody more into it. He got me into that. It's always somebody that gets you into the things you get. Iggy Pop I got into in radio. Nobody played Iggy Pop on the radio until Real Wild Child came out, right? Yeah. And then eventually they started playing Lust for Life because it was in a movie soundtrack. Other than that, nobody gave a shit about Iggy Pop. Good thing we had friends that turned us on to things that radio didn't care about. So that's if I can leave one thing in radio, in my legacy, as it were, is that I sneak bands that matter, that radio didn't care about, into the context of a program. My Records and Rockstars radio show, I sneak the Stooges in context of whatever the theme is. No one's playing the Stooges on the radio, but they matter. People talk about Green Day being a punk band. No, punk was Iggy Pop. Ramones were a kind of punk, but Iggy Pop was the original punk. There was nothing bigger and bolder than Iggy Pop, and the fact that he was Bowie's friend, his career. You get me started, I can't stop.
Well, the best, in spite of myself, I remember when I lived in Edmonton, my buddy Steve Burgess and I, we went to see the Pretenders and Iggy Pop with the reviewers, Helen Matella and I forget the other girl, from both papers. And I mean, I remember going, oh, this is so cool, you know. I felt like a kid, even though I'd been in radio for like 10 years at the time. So we're in the second row, and Iggy comes on, and I had like you were saying, I had a friend who was big into the Stooges and Iggy when he was younger. So I knew, not through osmosis only, but I knew some of the songs.
Sure.
Best concert I've ever seen in my freaking life.
That's great. Massey Hall, Iggy and the Stooges. He had Mike Watt on bass, but he had the brothers on guitar and drums, both of whom are dead now. But this was early 2000s? Yeah. And the Stooges are on stage at Massey Hall. It was, to your point, it was the best show I've ever seen, too. It was mind-blowing. Iggy Pop, there's no one with more energy. And he was 70 years old, for Christ's sake, and he still does it. Wow.
Have you ever been starstruck by anybody? I mean, okay, let me backtrack.
Ahead.
You have to be if you're a fan, but I don't know how you're wired. When's the first time it happened?
I think the most obvious, there were two really obvious times. One was Pearl Jam, not because they had the lineage and the heritage and the that Led Zeppelin does, but certainly sitting in Seattle's studio / rehearsal space with Stone Gossard and Eddie Vedder. I was a little starstruck just because of the impact in the 90s of Pearl Jam. And so it was current. It was happening now. Yeah. But even bigger than that, because of the lineage and the heritage and the time and the records, was Plant and Page the first time. When Robert Plant came through the door of that Soho hotel room, he looked 7.5 feet tall. We always saw Robert as a very tall man on stage in concert footage of Led Zeppelin. But here's the kicker. And he did seem that big, and he acted that big, and he was that big. And then I left. But then subsequently, I got to meet him a few more times. And where I went, wow, was we had a photo taken the last time I saw him a few years ago in the city of Toronto. And I looked at the photo after when I was posting it to Facebook. And I laughed at myself because we're exactly the same dimension. We're the same height. Our waist is the same place. We're basically probably the same weight at that point. And I thought, it's amazing how you build these people into, well, the icons that they are musically. But at the end of the day, they're not as tall as you make them out to be. And they're not as non-human as you make them out to be. They still put their pants on one leg at a time, and they still, go to McDonald's for a burger every 6 months because they're really hungry. They're just people.
Many times throughout my career, not as much now because I don't work at a physical radio station anymore. I record over there. But
you're like, yeah, I'm here in the attic of my house.
Well, there's an element of that of being cool. I remember thinking, don't talk to them about music. Talk to them about anything else. But I tried too hard and sounded a little goinky, I think. Because I tried too hard not to say, I really want to ask you about this. And there's that thing that happens in your brain when you're a young broadcaster as opposed to being a guy who goes, guy to guy, let's talk.
Yeah. Well, that's where it really felt like we were two guys just talking about stuff. And we forgot that there was a camera rolling and an audio rolling. Was David Bowie. He is a regular bloke. He was, as they say, a regular bloke in a genius, in a musical icon's body. He did all that stuff, but he could relate and talk to you with sincerity and depth and warmth, like you were just two guys in a room. And that's what it was like. And more than anyone I've ever talked to, David was that. Now, I have to concede that I was fortunate to get him in his early 50s rather than in his 20s or 30s when he would have been insecure, cocky, all the things that we are when we're young people. He said to me, you become the person you were always meant to be. And I love that about David Bowie.
That's a good clip.
It's a good clip. Self-awareness is a gift that we eventually give to ourselves if we allow it. And he had all that.
We'll have more of our conversation with Jeff Woods coming up next week. Make sure you comment on our video, subscribe to our channel, and share our video. And all the links to Jeff Woods in the description of this video.